You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at politics and football in Ukraine. It was supposed to be a tourist draw, mark Ukraine's integration with Europe, and allow President Viktor Yanukovych to strut his stuff alongside continental bigwigs. Now it looks like the Soccer Cup Euro 2012, which Ukraine co-hosts with Poland from next month, is going to be a public relations disaster for the country. A growing number of European political leaders are boycotting the Ukraine-hosted games because of the treatment of jailed opposition leader Yulia Tymoshenko. Tymoshenko is locked up following a corruption prosecution that critics say was politically motivated. She is currently in hospital after a hunger strike and an alleged beating by prison guards. President Yanukovych has already had to cancel a high-level parley in Yalta because of Euro complaints. The prospect of an empty VIP section in the Olympijski Stadium in Kiev must be daunting for the president. So, was the Ukraine government setting itself up for a costly fool by hosting Euro 2012? Is the German Chancellor Angela Merkel correct that Ukrainians suffer under dictatorship and repression? And what does the Soccer Cup debacle spell for Ukraine's future relations with Europe and Russia? To probe these questions, we're hosting a discussion in our London studio. I'm joined by Orysia Lutsevych from the foreign policy think tank Chatham House, Jana Kobzova, an analyst for the European Council on Foreign Relations, and over the line from Ukraine by Maxim Eristavi, our Kiev correspondent. Okay, to get the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single-sentence answer from each of you to the following question. First of all, to you, Jana, should European political leaders boycott the Football Cup?
I think they should. If they want to see progress towards democracy in Ukraine, that's the only thing they should be doing.
Okay, and Orysia?
Well, I think they should if they don't want to show Europeans that first they were putting pressure on President Yanukovych and then they are celebrating drinking champagne together. This will not be consistent.
And Maxim?
No, I think it shouldn't be any boycott because of Tymoshenko's case, because its international perception often has black and white gradients.
Maybe I'll let you carry on there, Maxim, because that's an interesting point. Why is it not so black and white?
Let's face the fact of European and American media, also politicians, are playing their part in this scandal. They're not observing or consulting anymore. They're active players. And pretty often it's just selective picking of the facts and generalizing and a lot of bias from their side. I can understand why global, particularly North Atlantic media are doing this. You need to keep audience interesting and can't lost it because of too much details. The politicians are doing it for the same reason. You need to keep focused to your constituency. So in the end, we have the story of pro-democracy leader Tymoshenko unlawfully jailed by brutal authoritarian regime of Yanukovych. And even if it's not near the truth, it's pretty popular and widespread outside of Ukraine. I mean, when I'm telling the story of American election or European debt crisis for Ukrainian audience, I rather will be generalizing also. But here we are crossing dangerous lines between the truth and objectivity.
When you say that it's not a simplistic tale of an authoritarian government imprisoning this princess in the tower, Yulia Tymoshenko, if that's not the simple truth, what is the complex truth?
I'm not trying to tell you that this Tymoshenko scandal is very complex, but it's not black and white for sure. So let's begin with President Viktor Yanukovych. We can't deny that his methods often democratically challenged. He doesn't have a lot of political talent, and yes, this Tymoshenko trial is pretty selective and charges are questionable. But this is silly to paint him as authoritarian ruler, such as those, I don't know, in Belarus or Uzbekistan. Yanukovych is democratically elected leader in open election approved by international community. And Tymoshenko's trial, though selective but in line with Ukrainian law. Then, in other part, we are having European biased perception of Yulia Tymoshenko. Yes, she was the main player in pro-democracy Orange Revolution, but I'm watching her for long years, and she's always articulate pretty authoritarian ideas too. Her concept of power is based only on individual ruling. But the main thing here to understand is Ukrainian politics are pretty brutal, without rules or moral codes, and local politicians raised an atmosphere of enormous corruption and complete detachment from constituency are and will use every possible tactic to make their goal. Lies, distortion, everything. It's true for government, but it's true for opposition also.
Before I turn to the other guests, I'd just like to throw one more question at you. If you say that Tymoshenko's prosecution was unfair, that it was politically motivated, and that Ukraine suffers from a lack of rule of law, why do you then conclude that it's not right for countries which have a higher standard of rule of law, such as members of the European Union, why is it not right that their political leaders make a stand and say, no, Ukraine must try and raise these standards?
You know, James, because it's very selective stand. You know, I'm not very shocked by this extremely biased perception of Tymoshenko scandal. In Europe, it happens all the time with every major story breaking globally from Ukraine. What strikes me the most is how this scandal played out like political ping pong between opposition and ruling parties in Europe. They're just using it, I think, amid 2012 election fever on continent. Do you remember among first calls to boycott Yalta and Euro were those from German opposition, then from Italian and I think British also, and then those were followed by official statements. And as I said earlier, all these radical decisions, from diplomatic point of view, of course, were made on biased perception. I can't remember any investigation expeditions or public questioning from Europe. European politicians have just picked words of one side of the conflict and ready to go for full-blown conflict. But you can't play black and white international politics. It's reckless and dangerous, especially in case of huge 40 million country with complex and no-rule politics.
Okay, I'm going to bring the other guests in there. Maybe turn that over to you, Jana. It's just a game of political ping-pong that European leaders are playing here.
I don't think so. I think the game is slightly different, and I understand what Maxim is saying in terms of different standards applied to Ukraine, but I think EU is right to apply these higher standards for one simple reason. Ukraine, in its foreign policy, aspires to become an EU member. That's the difference that the EU has in its relationship with Ukraine, with Russia or Belarus or any other country, and that's why the EU should be applying these tough rules, because yes, I understand politics are brutal, there is no really rule of law in Ukraine. That's precisely what EU doesn't want to have as a neighbor in a country that aspires to be an EU member.
And Orysia, I think you're probably going to chime with that one?
Well, I think that the politics is very much about perceptions, whether we like it or not. It's also very much about emotions. And emotions that are spreading around Europe is about corruption, is about oligarchic economy, is about a country where you have a system built around one-party dominance. It's about media censorship. It's about no rule of law. So based on this background, of course, you see very emotional take on of some of the European politicians on this Tymoshenko case. And as you mentioned, Maxim, and also in your introduction, it was a selective prosecution. Of course, the Prosecutor General assessed that some other members of the Party of Regions are also prosecuted for corruption. But at the very minor cases, we don't see big cases against corrupt officials, ministers in Ukraine taking place by Ukrainian legal system. So I think that what we face is that elite in Ukraine for whom the values of rule of law and democracy are rather alien, and they demonstrate it not just by their words but also by their deeds in Ukraine.
Maxim, I'll let you pick up on any of those points.
Very good points about selective law and case of Tymoshenko, but let me be here clear. I'm not against persecution of Ukrainian leaders for anti-democratic tactics. The thing that frustrates me the most that this selective or emotional reaction on Ukrainian news, it happens all the time from a side of European politicians. And it's pretty frustrating to watch, especially from inside of Ukraine, because it does more damage than good. Look for all those Ukrainians turned out anti-European after boycott scandal. For a country, Euro championship, it's a question of national pride and sport, not Tymoshenko or human rights. And it's dangerous ball to play, I think.
Maxim, I actually agree with your point that the game that the EU is playing now doesn't really have the best resonance among Ukrainian public, and I totally understand that. But I think at the same time we have to see the other side of the story, which is the Europeans' frustration with what is happening in Ukraine. And as you rightly said, Yanukovych was elected democratically in 2010, and the EU has from the very beginning tried to work with this president. No, it was him and under his watch that the EU and Ukraine have concluded the association agreement negotiations. So there was a lot of optimism about Yanukovych when he came to power. There was lots of willingness to work with him. And until very recently, there was very few criticism that you would hear vocally from the Europeans, because they tried to work with the government through quiet diplomacies, through negotiations. And I think the fact that the Europeans are now openly talking about boycott is also a signal of frustration the EU has with Ukraine, which, as I understand, some of the Ukrainians might have with the EU, and that's understandable. But just to illustrate the point, that's why once the quiet diplomacy failed, why the talks that were happening with Yanukovych and his government failed, that's when the EU decided to go open. But that wasn't the case from the very beginning. I mean, EU has tried to work with Yanukovych on a very constructive base on a number of issues.
I just want to jump in here with the whole damage, as Maxim was saying, to the society and the rise of this anti-European sentiments in Ukraine if Europe chooses to boycott the Eurocup. I think that Ukrainians, especially young people, and even in the east and the south of Ukraine, the recent opinion polls show that they aspire European membership. Over 50% of young people would like to be part of European civilization and European space. They would like to study in Europe, they would like to travel to Europe. And they see more and more that the problem of Ukrainian state is the state itself, where they are blocking their democratization and modernization potential. I think that what we see now in the civil society, we have the movement, we Europeans, we have people that are trying to raise the flag and say, we want Ukraine to be in Europe. And because now we have a global and transparent society with all these networks, the news about this movement should also spread out. And I think it's important to show that there is a part of the society that is modern, that is pro-European, and that sees its future in Europe.
This is the Voice of Russia. The London Bureau of the Voice of Russia is now live on digital radio and online, with news, comment and debate on weekdays between 4 and 7 p.m.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at politics and football in Ukraine. I'm joined by Orysia Lutsevych from the foreign policy think tank Chatham House, Jana Kobzova, an analyst for the European Council on Foreign Relations, and over the line from Ukraine by Maxim Eristavi, our Kiev-based correspondent. And I'd like to turn that one back to you, Maxim, because those were some interesting points raised by Orysia there. But you are actually in Ukraine yourself, and she was describing an aspiration among Ukrainian people for membership of the Eurozone or some kind of closer ties. They see themselves as European. Maybe you can give us your analysis of how the population there feels about this boycott of the games that they were hosting, which is obviously going to be a source of national pride. Are they torn?
Yes, of course, and I can say it's not torn, but it's pretty major thought here among population that political boycott of Euro Championship and with the Yalta Summit, it's a question of political fight inside of Europe and not a question of sports. So when we are talking with people here in Ukraine, a lot of people, especially young people, I'm among them also, it's not a question that we don't want to be in Europe or EU. It's done deal. The major part of population want this thing to happen. But it's a question of selective judgment about Ukraine and pretty emotional statements that we don't see pretty often from the European politicians towards Ukraine. So I think this emotional wave of accusations towards Ukrainian political elite, I think pushing back this elite to authoritarian rule. So my point, we can sit and talk and discuss, and maybe a European Union needs to send here some mission or some specialist to look at this Tymoshenko's trial and give Ukrainian people clear answer that there is a break of law Instead, we're having just emotional statements and accusations. It's not very good for perception among the Ukrainian population.
Maxim, can I just stick with you and just go through a couple of other details that relate specifically to the Euro 2012 Cup? Is it controversial in Ukraine that the government has spent something like $14 billion on hosting the championship? Just to put that into comparison, over here in the UK, where we are a wealthier country, we're spending $16 billion on the London Olympics. Is it seen as spending a lot of money on something that a nation with a struggling economy can't really afford?
Of course, it's a huge story, and there is no sensation or news in it that a lot of money was thrown in corruption hands, and a lot of tenders for construction or building were not clear and often marked by corruption. But the other story here, I think we need to look that Ukraine is a pretty undeveloped country. It's 20 years past since collapse of Soviet Union, and infrastructure in a pretty bad state of things, and we need a lot more money to throw at it so it could work, or we could hosting such a big an event like Euro Championship.
Okay, moving that one back to the studio, maybe Jana, the main point that comes from Maxim is that Yanukovych is not quite the bogeyman that he's cracked up to be from the other parts of the Eurozone. How do you make the strongest case you can for an increasingly form of authoritarian rule under his leadership?
The EU is coming to a conclusion that Yanukovych's style of government has increasingly become a problem for the European aspirations of Ukraine. No, they were really willing to engage with him before. But what is going on, it's not only Tymoshenko, really. Tymoshenko is a tip of an iceberg. It's a symbol of all the things that have been happening in Ukraine for past 2 years, starting with the concentration of powers in presidential hands, continuing with selective crackdown on some of the medias or closure of the medias, and so on. And she has become, perhaps unintentionally, symbolize all the wrongdoings during Yanukovych's government. And that's the problem. What the EU is trying to do with the boycott is to show that this way of government, the way that Yanukovych leads his country, is a problem for Ukraine's European aspirations.
Can you add anything to that?
I just want to pick up on one phrase that Maxim said, that Europe, by taking this one-sided position, is pushing Yanukovych into authoritarian corner. I don't think it's true. We keep hearing this about also that the West pushed Russia into this kind of path. And I want to make very clear that when Yanukovych came to power, I think his motivation, partly and specifically on the Tymoshenko case, was pure revenge. We should not forget that Ukraine faced 2004 Orange Revolution, where Tymoshenko was a symbol and where Yanukovych was deeply, deeply humiliated. I think that part of the motivation was a personal revenge. And another one, Tymoshenko is not an easy political opponent. She managed to spoil Kuchma's presidency, Yushchenko's presidency. He didn't want to have her in front of him on TV everywhere being a strong opposition leader. So he could kill two birds with one stone by putting her into jail. And in terms of creating a system of governance which is based basically on oligarchic economy, on a police control, on media control, it reminds us Russian system, but I would like to remind that the legitimacy of the regime among the society is very low. I mean, 66% of Ukrainians do not approve Yanukovych's presidency. His party support is now around 16 in the society, and of course he is based so much of his governance on the family and on the oligarchs who are now trying behind the closed doors, because of this relative isolation of Ukraine in the international arena, to privatize the economy. Ukraine is a super rich country. Of course, it's under-modernized and underdeveloped, but it has rich resources. I mean, gas supply, it has the ports, it has telecommunication, it has a great transit capacity, which is still underutilized. And having the country closed versus integrated and open is part of the interest in this game.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at politics and football in Ukraine. I'm joined by Orysia Lutsevych from the foreign policy think tank Chatham House, Jana Kobzova, an analyst for the European Council on Foreign Relations, and over the line from Ukraine by Maxim Eristavi, our Kiev-based correspondent. Maxim, maybe I can turn back to you there and get some comment back on what Orysia was saying. Basically, you accept all the criticisms of the Yanukovych government that are being raised in the studio. You're raising them yourself. Corruption, cronyism, transfer of power and assets into his own family and the people around him. So why is it that you draw such different conclusions from the guests I've got here in the studio?
My statement is not pro-Tymoshenko or anti-Tymoshenko. I'm trying to look at things objectively here, but what strikes me the most is just how selective about Ukrainian position European politicians are. Orysia and Jana told us about pretty interesting numbers from Ukraine about popularity of Ukrainian rulers, particularly Yanukovych. But let me tell you another thing about Yulia Tymoshenko as a opposition leader of Ukraine, as her often portraying politicians in European Union. Actually, we can't call her a opposition leader. With national ratings of 10-13%, it's a little bit bigger than Yanukovych's, but we can't call this national popularity. Even in jail, she's generating a pan-political capital, and her voters are facing away from her for more young leaders without toxic baggage such as hers. So yes, she was the main player in pro-democracy Orange Revolution, and yes, she led the first open government in Ukraine since the fall of Kuchma regime. But she's not a national leader anymore. Ukrainians are searching for new leaders without corruption baggage, without so many scandals as Tymoshenko has. So we can't talking about Tymoshenko as the only one opposition leader in Ukraine, and this frustrates me the most in outside coverage of Tymoshenko's trial in Ukraine.
Jana, on Maxim's issue there, the idea that Ukrainians are looking for new leaders, and looking down the road a little, they're going to have a chance to do this because there are parliamentary elections coming up later this year. There's a big question mark over whether or not these are going to be free or fair. And maybe you can talk about what this could spell for the future of relations with the European Union, or whether or not Ukraine is going to be swinging more towards Russia.
Yeah, actually, Maxim, I agree with your point about the search for new generations of leaders in Ukraine. I think that's one of the most important things that Ukraine needs now. As you said, I mean, Tymoshenko is not a new leader. She was part of the oligarchs in the 1990s. She has been present in the political life ever since then. So was Yanukovych, by the way. But I think that the problem here is that the Yanukovych government is actively trying to prevent emergence of this new, more competitive system where people from new generation would have a place and space to compete. And that's actually one of the worries for the parliamentary elections taking place in October, that there are serious doubts about how many parties are going to be allowed to run, how transparent, how fair the vote is going to be. And James, when you asked about the implications for the EU, I think that's going to be the ultimate benchmark. The relationship between EU and Ukraine now is quite frosty, but there is a lot of will in a number of member states to continue engaging with Ukraine, to sign as many agreements as possible, to bring Ukraine closer to the EU. But very few states are willing to do that at the cost of having a non-democratic country as one of their members. And that's the fear with the elections. The fear really is that these elections are not going to be fair and transparent.
Orysia?
Well, I think the ball, speaking of football, the ball is really in the Ukrainian civil society field. And I think the question of how tolerant will be this civil society towards increasing abuses of pluralism, which Jana mentioned. Equal level field is when you have pluralism, when you have new parties being able to function and run. And just recently, there is a new party called Democratic Alliance, which was refused registration, which was composed of totally non-corrupt, totally young generation of leaders coming mostly from NGOs and local activists. So I think that, of course, it's very important that Europe is sending strong messages, but I think this time it will be again back to Ukrainian citizens saying, are they happy with this kind of system? Are they ready to tolerate this kind of level of corruption and inefficient governance, which is holding the country captive? Or they would like to, this time perhaps, demand not just for the pure change of elite, like in 2004 on Maidan, asking for new political leaders to come to power and change the country, but they will be really asking for a liberal revolution to change the rules of this game, where people will be more empowered and where we will have more freedom of speech and more opportunities for young people to basically have their future in Ukraine.
Do you think that's what's going to happen? I mean, it's obviously the positive outcome that you'd like to see, but do you think that's likely?
You know, I remember 2004. I was in Ukraine at that time, in Kiev, and people were asking what is going to happen, because there was a feeling that elections will be forged, that this kind of elite is not going to give up access to all this richness. And I always think yes. I think how critical the mass of people will be. I don't know, but I think there will be thousands or perhaps millions of Ukrainians who would like to say no to manipulation and to this kind of corruption by money. Because, you know, when you see the wealth that is being exposed by all these estates that president now owns, and, you know, expensive abat-jours which cost like $100,000 hanging in just 3 of them like that in the hall of his dacha in the Carpathian Mountains. This is disgusting for ordinary people who are struggling for 20 years of transition to feed their families. So there could be a combination of injustice and dignity again that may draw people to a protest.
Maxim, last comments from you. Are Ukrainians going to say no to manipulation and corruption?
I think we shouldn't expect a lot from parliamentary election later this year, because, you know, from things I observe here, maybe we're experience time out for a generation, time out for politics in Ukraine, because we can see a lot of new leaders here, and it's not because we're experiencing a big campaign for preventing new leaders to emerge, as we heard earlier. It's just the way things are here. There is no one preventing them for emergence. But another great point, it's about corruption. Yes, it's enormous corruption here in Ukraine, and a lot of people feel frustration about this. But corruption, it's not only a deal of politicians. Corruption lays deep in the roots of Ukrainian society, where a lot of people think that it's a lot easier to pay bribe than to go through all bureaucratic corridors. So I think the main problem here with this boycott and this perception of Tymoshenko's case, and why all these meetings and negotiations with Ukraine from Europe are collapsing, is because in Europe they can't or they won't understand the complicity of situation in Ukraine, how it's complex, and how you can't trust any politician, or how corruption and oligarchism is played out here. So I think this is the main concern for us. We need to get a realistic perception of Ukraine in Europe, and we don't have it right now.
That was Maxim Eristavi, the Kiev-based correspondent for The Voice of Russia, saying that Ukraine's big decision is going to come way after the Euro 2012 Cup is finished and in October's parliamentary elections. I was also joined by Jana Kobzova, an analyst for the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Orysia Lutsevych from another foreign policy think tank, Chatham House. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned for the latest update on world news.